I always wondered what would happen if Honeycrisp Tales became a show. Hilda is a show I tentatively stepped into at the behest of Carousel, who assured me that it was just a cute show about cute babbies being cute. Despite this, I was still apprehensive because every show starts off cute before turning down the corner of grim road and edgy boulevard, but I was pleasantly surprised with Hilda. I wouldn't describe it as a comedy or a drama. It's more of a mellow show that's kind of in between. It reminds me of Little Bear or Rupert. Relatively even-toned slice-of-life shows that are just chill. Hilda starts off with the titular Hilda living in the forest with her mother with only animals and creatures for friends. Most of them are things like trolls and golems, but then we're introduced to original takes on classic fantasy creatures, like how the elves are obsessed with paperwork and contracts to the point that you have to sign a contract to even be able to see them. It's an interesting and unique premise, to be sure. You guys remember how in Calvin and Hobbes, the question of whether or not Hobbes was real was never really answered and you were just fully sunk into Calvin's imagination? Well, Hilda gives kind of the same vibe. You don't really know whether everything is real or if it's just Hilda's active imagination, and I like that. Additionally, there's some really heartfelt moments between Hilda and the creatures out in the wilderness. One of the first scenes of the show, for instance, features Hilda tying a bell to a troll's nose in order to know when it wakes up. But the bell ends up making the troll miserable and chases after Hilda to get it off, which she does. I don't know, maybe it's the framing or the music, but it was just a really touching moment for something so basic. It's soft, which is why it just breaks my little heart that when 2 episodes in, they pack up and move to a big city and only occasionally returning to the forest to spend time with the fun creatures. The circumstances are especially shitty because Hilda spends an entire 2-parter talking to the elves in order to be able to stay in the forest, and just as she succeeds and tells her mother, a pair of giants just fucking stomp their house into the ground.
So I know this might seem weird, but I'm holding a castle and this is the king, and basically, we don't have to move!
The house! Everything, it's gone, it's all gone. They haven't even noticed what they've done.
Like, wow, whoever on the writing team had that idea is a dick. I mean, it does tie into this whole thing about how they themselves are doing the same thing to the elves, but still, don't get me wrong, this is a really good bit of irony in that Hilda's now subjected to the same behavior she's been unknowingly engaging in, but still, fuck you anyway. After that, we spend most of our time watching Hilda be in the Girl Scouts and try and fail to interact with children, and then occasionally some creature goes bonkers and requires them to go out into the woods for a bit. The city Hilda actually lives in has a wall designed specifically to keep monsters out, like a literal fun barrier erected by the fun police themselves. This is where Hilda tends to lose me because the premise of a little girl interacting with magical creatures that might be real or might be her imagination, like Calvin and Hobbes, gets throttled the moment Hilda's mother moves them to Trollberg and we start the usual little kid slice of life story. I mean, it's not bad. It's still very good. The bulk of the series set in Trollberg is just perfectly fine and serviceable, but the starting premise was so good and so interesting that the move to Trollberg is soul-crushingly disappointing. Additionally, the plot starts making leans into the direction of Cerebus syndrome in the final episode of the season, where everything starts getting really tense and heavy, but I'm going to remain as optimistic as I can and just hope that that was done to make the season finale feel important. Please, Hilda, just please don't be edgy. I actually looked into the entire first season because the initial episode is so wildly different from the rest that only covering those would give a false impression of what the audience is in for. Had this change of course not happened, I would have stuck to my usual first episode only rule. I gotta say, Hilda might be my favorite main character in a show ever. She has such a bright personality and imagination, and her affinity for nature is so engaging. When I was a kid, I used to love exploring the woods that covered like 90% of Nova Scotia, and it seems like the farther back in time you go, the more this was an omnipresent hobby. The fact that Hilda has such a thirst for nature and a desire to leave Trollberg at every possible opportunity is satisfying because I like the forest more than Trollberg with their anti-fun wall. As much as I resent Hilda's mother for moving the plot out of the countryside, I do like her as a character. It's not often you get to see a single mom in cartoons, though I expect there to already be 20,000 "Who is Hilda's father?" theory videos on YouTube by the time this sentence is over, and I love how Hilda's antics are always 2 heartbeats from giving her a stroke. When it comes to mothers in cartoons, I've always liked the ones that are always stressing the fuck out because their daughters are rambunctious and hyperactive, but when everything simmers down, it's really soft. I love soft family dynamics. A few people have complained to me that the show would be more interesting if their dynamic was more dysfunctional, and honestly, fuck off. Dysfunctional family dynamics are overdone, and in many cases they aren't done well. Not everything has to be complicated and edgy. Sometimes we need things that are wholesome. You don't need to make it more fucking complicated. It's a story about a single mom trying to raise her daughter. It's soft.
Did someone say single mom?
What? No. Bad sketchy. Unfortunately, those are the only human characters that are worth talking about. Hilda has the reverse of the problem Star vs. the Forces of Evil had, where in that show, the human characters and setting were generally more interesting, while the story on Muni was duller than a dollar store pocket knife. In Hilda, the human characters are pretty bog standard archetypes, while the wilderness outside Trollberg is a lot more mesmerizing. While Hilda's human friends get a little bit better in an episode about, I think, witches? They still pale in comparison to the elves, trolls, and monsters that Hilda was running around with, having wholesome, good-natured fun time. It helps that the entire show looks like a children's storybook come to life. I know it's weird for me to be on the surface talking about animation when I'm usually in the core beating the story and themes to death with a tiny hammer, but honestly, Hilda is the prettiest show I've seen in a long time. I know a lot of people, or rather a lot of pathetic sad sacks, are sick of this particular animation style, but I love the way everything is drawn like it jumped out of a coloring book. If you look closely at some shots, you can see the line work is actually rough and uneven, like it was drawn with a crayon. I love that storybook aesthetic for cartoons. It reminds me of cartoons from the 90s that were based on slice of life children's books like the Berenstain Bears. Actually, does anyone remember Little Critter? Those books are fun. One thing I will completely debase myself in gratitude for is the fact that this show isn't serialized, so I was content stopping wherever I felt like stopping to write this first impressions. Even the finale is an entirely brand new story disconnected from everything else. When every episode has its own distinct ending, every episode manages to leave its own unique impact, and you don't feel like you're just being given a credit sequence as a commercial break. It meant I could enjoy an episode at a time without the story feeling incomplete. It's just more satisfying to watch a show like this. I know a lot of people who can't stand Steven Universe anymore because, you know, yikes. But they've confessed to me that they're still watching it because they've already invested so much time in it. And I think that's something that needs to be talked about. This business model of addiction in place of engagement to keep people watching even if they're not enjoying it. So far, Hilda isn't doing that. Every episode has a conclusion that doesn't tease the next one, and it's so good. It's good that each episode has a satisfying ending. It's good that it's not perpetually dragged out. It's good that the show isn't trying to make some massive story happen. As is the case with every show I cover, I dread that this will stop being the case by the next season, and the show will just start this long, constantly running story stretching across the entire wilderness as the lore of all these monsters is put before the fun and the gang ventures out across the land only for Frida to grab a magic rock and betray everyone because the creator thought it would be such a shocking twist that just pisses everyone off. But maybe I'm just being paranoid. After all, I said the same thing about Tangled, and I'm sure I was wrong about that. I hate everyone.